En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Todos los días escuchamos que el mundo que conocemos ya no es el mismo. Tenemos más información y más tecnología que nunca, pero persisten las desigualdades sociales al tiempo que aumenta la temperatura del planeta y sentimos las consecuencias en nuestro entorno diario. El horizonte parece incierto, pero nosotros creemos que hay un gran poder de cambio en cada decisión que tomamos, en la forma como vivimos y las metas que perseguimos. En el Grupo Bancolombia estamos convencidos de que es posible un mejor futuro. Por eso, hoy renovamos nuestro compromiso para trabajar decididamente por un propósito común, que nos recuerde a los 30.000 empleados de la organización por qué nos levantamos todos los días. Promovemos desarrollo económico sostenible para lograr el bienestar de todos, impulsando que las cosas pasen con prosperidad, pensando siempre a largo plazo, para que podamos vivir con satisfacción y tranquilidad, todos y nadie se quede por fuera. Bancolombia, Banismo, Banco Agrícola y BAM. Sabemos que aunque somos diferentes, tenemos mucho en común. Este propósito es nuestra razón de ser. Refleja eso que nos apasiona y lo que mejor sabemos hacer, reconociendo que lo que nos hace sentir orgullosos de hacer parte de esta organización es la convicción con que enfrentamos los retos de la sociedad. Nuestro propósito también habla de elevar juntos el bienestar de nuestros países con más y mejores oportunidades. Empleados, colaboradores, usuarios, clientes, accionistas. Todos, desde nuestro rol, podemos cambiar el mundo un paso a la vez, teniendo claro que un mismo propósito nos inspira a trabajar por el bienestar de todos. Nos sentimos orgullosos de decir que en el Grupo Bancolombia promovemos desarrollo económico sostenible para lograr el bienestar de todos.
Te invitamos a conversar sobre cómo podemos seguir avanzando juntos en la ruta de la sostenibilidad, porque más importante que ganar el año es aprender. Más importante que los resultados es la forma en que los alcanzamos, comprometidos con el desarrollo armónico de la sociedad y trabajando para hacerlo mejor todos los días.
Good day, how are you all? I'm Jordi Anderson, live from Rio de Janeiro for the Gabo Festival, in conversation with Jordi Esteva. This is an effort to recommence a conversation that we began the other day and that came out wrong. It was my fault. I was in a part of Rio de Janeiro without coverage, and everything came out wrong. Now I'm back in my hotel in Ipanema, a bit closer to the asphalt in Rio de Janeiro. But I'm afraid it is still a bit dicey when it comes to the connection. We don't have as much time as last time because I'm here reporting, but I hope that most of those of you who are with us today caught the first part of the conversation on Monday, and therefore you already participated in the preamble of this conversation with Jordi. Very quickly, though, I want to go back and make sure that Jordi can hear me. All right, well, once again, I'm so pleased to be here with Jordi, a filmmaker and documentary maker, great traveler and writer, photographer from Catalonia, who has spent a career exploring remote realities, remote as compared to our modern reality in cities. He's gone to countries as diverse as Egypt, Morocco, Ivory Coast, the Arabian Seas, and the island of Socotra. And now, last, he's gone to a Colombian region that I feel for most Colombians might be as far away as Ivory Coast, and perhaps it has something in common with it. I'm talking about Chocó, a place called Cabo Corrientes. I was watching a film that Jordi made not long ago. I'd like for you to talk to us about it. It's extremely beautiful. It's also melancholic. What we see in this film are people in a reality that is so foreign to those we see represented in this ad that we saw at the beginning of this conference, a modern Colombia full of skyscrapers and glad people. I'm under the impression that in Chocó, that part of Colombia that you registered in your documentary, Jordi, as well as the other places that you have sought to explore in recent decades, are opportunities to see the former world, to go into history. The name of this chat is Postcards from Paradise or something like that. I don't know if these are quite postcards from paradise, but they are journeys, vignettes, glimpses of the original world. Is that what your search is about? Tell us a bit, share a bit of your concept of what inspires you, what motivates you to go to these places. Certainly. Well, what I like, what I'm inspired by, what I seek, is to speak with older people because they are the repositories of an ancestral wisdom. Of course, I'm talking about places that are remote, as you said, so unlike the image that we have of Colombia. But there are also places such as the Gulf of Tribuga that have a deeply different reality. The problems of a person in Medellin have absolutely nothing to do with the problems that a person might have in Birudo and Nuquí, in Chocó. So for me, this documentary, I prefer to call it a film because it's not my intention to make a typical documentary. What I want to do is something poetic. The focus is perhaps anthropological, if you will. It's about going and speaking to the elderly for them to tell me stories, speaking to women. And with all this material, I create something new. But I'm very interested in poetry as well because I feel that poetry speaks to a place. Some things don't need to be said so directly. Perhaps the image can speak to it on its own. So for me, Chocó, this film shot in Cabo Corrientes was very important and very different. So far, the 3 films that I had made were based on previous work that I had done of research, whether it be in Ivory Coast, the island of Socotra, and in Ghana. So I had begun by taking a whole lot of pictures in black and white, then writing, searching in memory, and finally making a documentary. Registering old people's memories, and then finally making a documentary. So the way this idea evolved was with the work of a great anthropologist and filmmaker and a friend of mine who's Colombian from Cucuta. We became very close. We met in the festival in Barranquilla, the Auteur Cinema Festival, where I had the opportunity to show my film Journey to the Country of the Souls, shot in Africa and Ivory Coast and Ghana. So Herman said, I would like very much to work with you. And I said, well, I would like that even more. He said, why don't you do something about Colombia? And I said, well, because I'm lacking this reference. In my work, I go to seek lost time, but I also need memory to act upon what I have in my head. It can be very difficult to write about something directly. So I said, well, I'd like to do something, but I don't have any information. I don't like showing up at a place and poking around with a camera and two colleagues getting into people's homes. I'd like for it to be a bit more prepared. So Herman did some prior work in El Golfo de Tribuga, in Cabo Corrientes, Birudó. And one day I showed up there. So I showed up there with a mini team. There were 3 of us from Spain. A sound technician and the cameragrapher, because for me sound is very important. It's about half the film, or sometimes even more. So we began to talk. I followed a script of the topics that I was most interested in, the stories, for instance, the myths, people's concerns, and I especially sought out the elderly, the older people, for them to talk to me about what intrigued them. And I insisted very much on this because I feel that through these aspects of spirits or beliefs that new generations don't want to know anything about, they say that they're lies, that they're just pulling the wool over their eyes. Through these, I go unspooling the affair. And I'm able to capture. This may sound pretentious, but I feel I can capture people's souls. And this is the method that we followed. It was very difficult because unlike Colombia, where people are very expansive, extremely charismatic, in Chocó it was a bit difficult because I don't like speaking of Chocó because I don't really know the whole province. What I know is the particular spot where we shot. And people there have suffered a great deal due to political circumstances. The guerrilla, the drug traffickers, the paramilitaries, the army. So there are people that are very untrusting. They have been abused on all sides, so it's very difficult for them to open up. But finally, little by little, we each have to wake up as we can. So ultimately, I got people to open up a bit and tell me their stories. And from all of this, these hundreds of hours, I edited and I made the film Stories from Cabo Corrientes with very lyrical scenes, very poetic, to divide it into major blocks of things that have always fascinated me, insects, nature. Because besides stories, I like to show the habitat. And if it's done poetically, so much the better than with a voiceover talking about God knows what. I can't hear you. Okay, we can hear you now. All right, simply a warning to speakers. I continue to hear a great deal of electronic interference on my side. I hope it's not making it hard for you to hear me. You can hear me, Jordi? I can hear you. It's frustrating. In any event, I very much agree with you classifying your work as films, not as documentaries. In fact, they penetrate, and one is left with the feeling of almost living with the place, dreaming with the place. They have a way of penetrating one that many documentaries don't, I would say. I say this to acknowledge what you have been achieving in your work. I cannot get this film of Cabo Corrientes out of my head, a scene where two men are speaking and one is telling the other what is a kind of myth. He knows it as a story. He talks about Charles V, who was persecuted and who brought the Africans, which is to say his ancestors, in cages. It is a real story, apparently told, passed on through centuries of oral tradition and mythified, but it's conceived in such a way that the repositories of the story is a sort of creation myth. But at the same time, it uses the name of the Spanish king, and one isn't sure whether he's talking about a kind of maroon king, a local maroon king, a slave who's been freed, or Charles V himself. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The interesting thing is that you are seeing someone, hearing someone who perceives the world in this manner. And there I feel that I am traveling to a place that inhabits all the times, the present and the past. We're not in a mall in Barranquilla. We're not in the Explorama Museum in Medellin, no matter how lovely it is. We are not in Bogota's Bolivar Square. We are in another place that inhabits all the former centuries, all the way back to the 15th, and lives and transmits Africa as well. It's a way of crossing time and space that I feel is very effective and that gives a lot. And I would like besides acknowledging this and communicating this, I'd like to discuss a question that I think was left hanging last time. What does exploration mean to you? This is a question that is always very present for me, because I too am a nomad. I've seen the world change in my life. I always felt that I'd sort of been born in the wrong century, that I was born too late, and I've spent my life in search of the real world before it became monochrome, monothematic, the consumer world. Those places that disappear before the arrival of the consumer world, that frivolizes them and turns those authentic cultures, at times very difficult, but nevertheless authentic, with their oral histories and their myths, into a kind of touristic fetish. So that's something that I wanted to discuss with you. What does it mean to you to explore nowadays? What is discovery? And what do we have to discover in the world? Yes, well, I think exploring and discovery has nothing to do with the National Geographical Society. There were people who went off discovering things. It didn't have to be a white man. So for me, this search, in fact, for me, exploring is seeking memory nowadays. What I'm interested in is seeking elders who have an oral literature
They also have plants, the pharmacopoeia of the forest, all of this knowledge that is not esteemed or that people shrug at. People in their own countries, the bourgeoisie or the middle class in the capitals of their countries, oftentimes I was asked, why do you go to Tribuga? Or why do you go to the oases of Egypt or to Socotra? Those are places that are lagging behind. People have nothing to offer you. They believe in things that are absurd. They'll only tell you silly things. And I responded, that's not true. That is simply not true. These are traditional doctors. They are repositories of an entire culture, a heritage that is about to disappear, and we have to do something to preserve this. So, something has come to my mind.
One more thing, when I was in Barranquilla with my friend Germán Pisano, thinking about how he would make the film, I was invited to San Basilio de Palenque to screen the film that I had made in Africa there with some boys and girls, some young people that were very interested in film and documentary.
So it was wonderful. I believe it's the best cinema where we've been able to stream the film because it was a place filled with chickens. In the living room, they were using clothespins to hang it. And this is where they were able to show the film. It was a very beautiful moment. So everyone knew what kind of a camera could be used. They asked lots of technical questions. So I said, well, you are living here in San Basilio and you have your grandparents with marvelous stories to tell that are going to disappear. So every time one of these elders passes away, it's like an entire library has been burnt down, as has been said by the Mali writer. So they said, well, take your mobile phone, whatever you have available to you, go talk to your elders and have them tell you stories at night and record it, regardless of whether it's a good quality recording or not, because what matters is the contents, what they're going to share with you. And if you begin to learn these film techniques and documentary making techniques, when you dominate it, then perhaps your grandmother will have passed away. So insist on this, on doing this. And I was very glad. I believe I convinced some of them to do so. But regarding what you said earlier about Choco, or Tribuga specifically, what surprised me was the Spanish that they speak there. It's a beautiful form of Spanish. And they use words that made me sometimes wonder, what does this word mean? And at night I'd say, what does X word mean? And he'd say, I have no idea. This is used only here. It's local terms or slang. So one day, when I had a good connection, which was something rare there, and I was able to go online, I looked up some of these words in the RAE dictionary, which is the Royal Academy of Language, of Spanish language. And these are words that existed. They were perfectly correct words, but they're words that are no longer used in Spain or in Latin America since the 18th or 19th century. And then one of the participants in the documentary, the film, tells the story of Hirinello, who fell in love with the daughter of a king. It's a very Spanish story. So I said, well, how are they familiar with the story? It's one of these ancient romance stories. So I found that was very interesting. And in fact, one of the women at the end that sings a song about a birdie saying, be quiet, your song hurts me. This is a copla, which is also present in Spanish flamenco. And there are the same words in these couplets, but it has a different rhythm and different format. So I think it's fascinating to see this exchange there is over centuries, over time. It seems as if time had stopped. And I found it very interesting. So when I heard that song, I mean, I got chicken skin because it was incredible to hear that from these people who are apparently so distant in a different place in the middle of the jungle, etc. So I found it to be fascinating. Yes, of course. Jordi. I think that with this testimony and repositories of other stories that have been forgotten or sometimes extinct, we truly have an opportunity before us that is a very valuable opportunity to be able to travel time in a different way. I don't know if you, since you are so familiar with Africa, know of this or if you've been there, but I've been told. Now, while you were speaking, these words came to mind that are no longer used. The couplets on the island of Sao Tome, the old Portuguese colony in Africa. Every day they celebrate, and it's the only place where apparently they celebrate a form of a carnival, but it's not a carnival the way we know of in Latin America and the Caribbean, but rather it's one that involves performance and costumes to tell the story of Carlo Magno. But it's a ritual that was apparently was very well known in the Middle Ages in Europe, and it began to disappear until the only place where it remains is Sao Tome. So each person in the village has a specific role. So one is a prince, the other is ex-woman, etc. And they incarnate these characters from the Middle Ages, from the Europe of 600 years ago that has already disappeared on an island off Africa. It's just fascinating. And the other thing that came to mind is once when I entered the Amazon jungle in Peru when I was 20 years old, in other words, a long time ago, and I was going up a river near the border along Brazil. So I was going up the river in a canoe, and we crossed a canoe with an indigenous woman and child. And they saw us and began screaming, panicked. They reached the edge of the river and left. I didn't know what had happened, but they were repeating a word out loud over and over again. And they were fleeing, terrified due to my arrival. And there was a small village or just several little houses, and they had left everything and fled to the jungle. So it took me several years to be able to track down the meaning of the word that they were screaming over and over again, which was pistaco, pistaco. And it so happened, well, then I was asking about Peru. I was asking in Peru, and it looks like this word meant like a devil that is here to suck the oil out of bodies. And it was a form of a myth that every time the indigenous cultures feel threatened or in danger due to the external world, this belief would return with greater force. And in some cases, it was connected to fear. In my case, they were afraid. And in other cases, it was represented through hostility. Several years later, you could no longer go up that river because they would attack with a bow and arrow anyone that was traversing the river. Anthropologists know how to explain this phenomena very well, but I eventually understood that, well, at the beginning I said, well, perhaps there are people in the oil industry that are abusing of the indigenous peoples, and that's why they react this way. But it turns out that this has been passed down through oral heritage for over 500 years now, this belief of pistaco. And the origin of that belief is tied to apparent abuses committed by Spanish conquistadores in their first expeditions, abuses against the indigenous peoples in the jungles, where apparently they killed some and reduced their bodies in a fire to use the fat to grease their cannons and rifles. And the terror was such that it remained as a terror within the jungles, and eventually I was able to understand it differently. But that this also served as a form of a shield or a barrier to any outside person wishing to enter. But anyway, I thought it was fascinating. Right, Jordi? Yes. Well, I've only been to Choco once, not in the same place where you were, though. I was there about 2 years ago, and I spent several days in a small village of Afro-descendants that had recovered their land after the massacres conducted by the paramilitary forces in the 90s. And they had returned to their lands, and they were living sort of off of the land, still surrounded by the paramilitary guerrilla, trying to recover their lives. It was not easy at all. But as you have said, these were people who were very affected by the horrors they had experienced, but also very brave, living in a form of community, living off of the land the way they always had. So that's an experience that definitely left an impact on me. I don't know if we're in the same situation, if we're going to have the same format as a few days ago, where we're going to receive questions. Are you receiving questions from the audience, Jordi? No. Oh, yes, yes, of course. Well, then we could move on to interact with the audience, right? So I wanted to move on to the Q&A section so that we can interact. Yes, they are greeting us. I don't see any question as such. Okay, that's fine. Well, maybe my comment can encourage them to send their questions. We have about 10 or 15 minutes remaining at most to answer the questions. But while you read those questions, I don't know if you're doing so, just to highlight the fact that this conversation with Jordi is one that we are doing within this edition of the Gabo Festival. But it is also as an incentive for those who are listening to us to reflect on travel writing. And for those of you who believe you have a story to contribute, and I'd like to frankly invite you to see Jordi's work so that you can have an idea of the fact that we have a role model, something that we can follow when it comes to travel writing. There's the Michael Jacobs Travel Writing Fellowship for this year. There's an award that we celebrate every January. It's something sponsored by the foundation and also by the festival. And we are in the 7th edition of this award for the Travel Writing Fellowship. The call is still open. I believe it's open until the 6th or 7th of January. In any case, please look into the website of the foundation and reflect on it. But before you send in your proposal, please look at Jordi's work, because we'd like to see more of that, and not so much that I bought a car and traveled with my girlfriend from Argentina to El Salvador. Okay, that would be it. Okay, here Rafael Gonzalez is wondering what book we recommend. what I recommend and what you recommend apart from our work. So what book or what films or photography we both recommend? I didn't understand the question. They're asking what books and films we recommend. Is that right? Correct. Yes. What films or books we could recommend on stories from secret paradises? Yes, I'm afraid you're chopping out, but I can say that authors, well, there are authors that stand out for their explorations and their traveling through the world and their travels for discovery. There are many that come to mind, but not necessarily due to them being popular or even due to their quality, but perhaps because they are a good benchmark. I can mention Paul Theroux. His surname is spelled Dhrrux. He is an American of French origin, and he has both fiction and nonfiction and lots of travel writing beginning in the 60s. He is already older, but he has engaged in a fascinating way with the world. And I would specifically or especially look at his early work written in the 60s, one from a train ride, and another one that he did through Asia specifically. Bruce Chaplin is famous, and here we enter into a terrain of authors, both Bruce Chaplin and Kapuscinski, who have their own form of literature. Some might call it faction because we don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction, both in the case of Chaplin and Kapuscinski, but their take is very interesting. And their prose is wonderful. It's exquisite. V.S. Naipaul, the deceased Trinidadian who won a Nobel Prize for his work before he passed away a few years ago, V.S. Naipaul. His fiction work is incredible. And his nonfiction work, which could be included in travel writing, are notable. I would like to mention specifically India, A Wounded Civilization, that he wrote in 1974. India, which was his homeland, as a great piece. I could take another 20 minutes speaking of great authors, and there are no doubt younger authors as well, but these are my role models from my first decades of reading. I imagine Jordi has his own set. Well, John, you've mentioned many of the greats. Well, Naipaul and Theroux had a confrontation that was quite strong, right? And I don't agree very much with Naipaul's book on India because I find that much of what he says, also A Journey Through Islam, say, I feel like there are many biases, anti-India biases. He is kind of like a shameful Jew, right? He has that about him. So sometimes it can be a bit difficult because this can place a shadow on the great writer he is. I'm very interested in Norman Lewis. I believe he's a great writer. The Seeker, of course. Jan Morris, that changed his gender. And then there are some French writers, or Swiss in this case, Nicolas Souvier, that went on this journey at the end of the 50s or early 60s with a car and traveled to India and spent a lot of time in Moldova and began to tell wonderful stories. And then Michel Leris, which is Ghost Africa, and that journey that was done searching for artifacts for the Museum of Paris, sometimes interpreting Africa because they were calling on the fetiches and the witches. It's a very fascinating trip. If you ask me about documentaries and movies, I'll tell you what has inspired me. I really like Flaherty. He is a classic, older documentary maker, The Hombres de Adán, but I really like these sets he achieves. And in many cases, they are fakes or they don't exist because this Eskimo, it's a story of an Eskimo. And as with the drawings or Tintin, they close up the eyes to be able to hunt. The seals, or in the Hombres de Adán, where they have to fight against the elements. But it wasn't a family. They did a casting and he found a man and a woman and a young boy and had them play the role of a family. But although it was not real, I believe they're much more real than any other documentary where they just start shooting the first person they find, because he had previously worked on the research of the area. So all of the ideas he had and the notes he had taken of the people and such is what he was able to display. And then what is for me a strong influence is that even though he is a nonfiction filmmaker, he is a Bengal filmmaker, and what he communicates as far as poetry, what he communicates, sometimes he says more than a more elaborate discourse might say. And these two, for me, are the greatest, in my opinion, although perhaps their narrative or language is perhaps a bit older, but that's the way I see it.
One comment emerged. It's very true what you were saying about Naipaul and his vision. Colonial. Although he was a colonial subject, he had some identity problems. But precisely for that reason, it's interesting. I think we could have a whole conversation on that. The authentic gaze. The external gaze. I have thought a great deal recently when looking for stories, especially in various African countries. When I've traveled, for instance, to a country for the first time, Somalia and Sudan emerged, Zimbabwe as well. I always seek literature, whether it's fiction or historical book. And the trouble with Africa, as far as I found it, is that almost all the well-recognized authors are white or else from the colonial era. And this is something to consider and to try to overcome in the last 20 years. Certainly there are other ones, Kinua Kebe, Wale Soyinka, African authors that have been published and that we've known them for 50 years now or more. Senghor de Senegal, I can think of several. But in the last 20 years, there has been a kind of boom in African authorship. And these authors are beginning to be known throughout the world through the Booker Prize, for instance, and others. So at last we have a world in which the African voice is accepted, which was missing. I had an experience some 8 years ago in Sudan. I was very perplexed and even irritated by the fact that there was not a Sudanese voice that I could quote or get to know. In fact, Fessiger was practically the only author published in a region that I went to. And it was very much the voice of someone that had killed lions there 60 years ago, with his own way of objectivizing. Although with love, he was objectivizing the local people. In any event, we are in an evolution in our relationship to the worlds that are not ours. In our own lifetimes, Jordi, perhaps, we were born at the end of the colonial era, and the world that we have seen, on the one hand, has changed, become more modern, more Western, but it is also a world that has sought its own path. And as authors, we are trying to perceive and reflect as sincerely as possible this world. But as far as literature and travel, writing, there's a bit of everything in the world, and it's a very imperfect world, I would say, that still has a great deal to resolve when it comes to the gaze it casts on the places it writes about. I would say, ultimately, that I don't apologize for being a white man who writes in Africa. I think I have as much a right to write about other cultures as anyone else. But I do acknowledge that it does have a problematic history, and I'm more aware of that than perhaps I was in my youth. In any event, I don't know what you think. And I think that based on your remark, we have to end the session. We're out of time. I'm trying to think of names that came up to me. You speak of Sudan, which is a country that I adore and I have learned so much in. There's this writer whose name I don't remember now, and I should remember it because they used one of my photographs for the cover of his book, which is Season of the Migration to the North. He's a Sudanese intellectual. It's a work of fiction, but it's very well written. A Sudanese intellectual from the north who goes to London. There he marries a British woman, so there are all the cultural problems. And through this book, the book is very beautiful and it discusses all of this. And then, for instance, in Egypt, I was able to read all that grand Egyptian literature until Naguib Mahfouz received the Nobel Prize. No one knew that contemporary Egyptian literature exists. Taha Hussein, Mahfouz. I remember that in La Vanguardia, a very well-known paper from Barcelona, I remember that when Naguib Mahfouz won the Nobel Award, people were asking, they were saying, now we're going to be told that there's interesting contemporary literature in the Arab world with this sense of superiority. And the next day they had to stop and publish some tremendous elegies to Mahfouz because the French, who have longer tentacles, in Le Monde, they'd already published 2 or 3 pages on the greatness of the writer, and so they had to eat their own words. And then once again we have the trouble with the head. This Chimananda, what's her name? I can't remember her last name. It's hard to pronounce. Yes, it's difficult to pronounce. So much of the novel, it says something about the sun. It describes the drama of Nigeria during the terrible war it had. And this allowed me to understand that problem in Nigeria, which I hadn't until then. So there are very interesting people. That novel's called Half of a Yellow Sun. That's right, there's so much. Well, Jordi, and to our audience, I hope that this time we've been able to achieve something. Perhaps if we cut and paste today's with Monday's, we've done a whole. In any event, it was a great pleasure for me to see you and speak with you, Jordi. I hope that those of you who've joined us have felt the same. I hope we can do it again soon. And I hope we even get to see each other in the flesh soon. The name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. That's the full name of the great Nigerian writer. Thank you. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Jordi. Greetings from Rio de Janeiro. So long.